Welcome to the Curiosity Podcast, a show about everything e-commerce and digital business. The aim is simple, to help you thrive online. And now, your host, Matt Edmundson.
Welcome, my fellow e-commerce entrepreneurs. My name is Matt Edmundson, and this is the Curiosity Podcast. It is for those of us who are curious about e-commerce and want to know how to get better at doing digital business. And in this episode, I'm going to wrap up season 1. That's right. This is the final episode of season 1. I'm going to wrap up the show for this season. I'm going to tell you what's coming also in season 2 and some of the changes that you can expect in the podcast and why we're making them and what's going to happen as a result. So we've got all that in today's show. But before we jump into that, let me give a big shout out to today's sponsor, which of course is the fabulous and amazing Kurious Digital. Kurious Digital is the e-commerce platform that I use for all my e-commerce businesses. That's right. I use one platform. I have used many over the years, and with clients that I've consulted with, we've come across many, many other e-commerce platforms. And out of all of them that I've worked with, my favorite one by far is the Kurious Digital platform. So if you are in the market for a new e-commerce platform, do check out kurious.digital. That's curious with a K. Curiously, it is with a K and not with a C, but do check it out. And of course, I will put a link to Kurious Digital on the show notes, which you can see at the website at mattedmundson.com. You can check those out there. There will be a link which you can just follow along. It's as easy as that, right? It's as easy as that. Okay, let's get into today's show. Now, this, like I said, is the final episode of season 1. And I'm a big fan of doing podcast seasons because it actually gives you a natural break. It gives you a chance to stop and to reflect, to figure out what's gone well, what you need to change, where's the industry going, and all that sort of stuff. You get all that, you get a little bit of thinking space. So you're never stuck in one format. You can move along. So I'm a big fan of the season idea. So we are going to wrap this up, season 1. Season 2 is actually not that far away. Season 2 will launch in early 2020. So make sure you do subscribe to the podcast so that when we start again in 2020, you get all the access that you need, right? Now, what has been going on? Let's answer that question. What have we learned from the podcast? We're going to answer that question. And what is going to happen in season 2? We are going to get into that question as well. And I'm going to try and help maybe explain how all this has been working and how, if you are thinking about doing a podcast, and maybe why you should think about doing a podcast and how it can work for an e-commerce business. Okay. Now, what has been going on? For the keen-eyed amongst you, you have noticed that actually it's been a few weeks since we last posted a podcast. And I have to apologize for that. It is entirely my fault. Well, it's entirely my body's fault. I have not been well for a few weeks. And it caused us to get a little bit behind with the podcast. So thankfully, I am doing a lot better now. I have been to the hospital more times than I care to remember. I've been to see the doctor. I am super, super grateful for the NHS in this marvelous country in which I live. There's not a lot of things functioning that well in the UK at the moment, but the NHS is definitely something that I am eternally grateful for. Let me tell you, the doctors and nurses, they were wonderful. They took care of me. They're still taking care of me. And I'm super grateful for that. There's been a lot of stuff, let me tell you, from a personal wellness point of view that has been going on. I won't bore you with the details, but I'm about 95%. So thanks for thinking of me. Thanks for all the positive vibes, thoughts, and prayers. Much appreciated. Let me tell you, I really do value them. So, but it has caused me to be a couple of weeks behind on the podcasts. We are definitely wanting to obviously not make sure that happens in the future. And one of the things that you can do, this is perhaps lesson number 1 from learning podcasts. One of the things I've learned is actually you can do batch processing. In other words, you can record 3 or 4 episodes at a time and have some in the can, as they say, so that you always maintain your podcasting schedule. I just didn't have the last one in the can, and had been so busy reading up to it. Of course, Sod's law dictates that actually it just worked out that way, right? But normally I'd have 2 or 3 episodes in the can. So it's sort of pre-recorded, so we can maintain the delivery schedule, but we didn't this time. So anyway, that's what's been going on. Let's move on. So what have we learned from doing the podcast? What have we learned from the Curiosity podcast? We're 18 episodes in. We've done a lot of stuff. We've had guests on the show. We've done coaching calls on the show. We've done it where it's just been me talking. And then after a few weeks, we're like, no, let's not just have me talking. Let's get Sadaf in as well. And then we started doing the news thing, the e-commerce news in the middle to break it up a little bit. Because, as much as I like the sound of my own voice, I appreciate consistent Matt is not brilliant for everybody. Although that's what we're doing in this podcast. But yeah, so it's one of the early lessons we learned. Actually, breaking it up was good. Now, let's talk about why we did a podcast. Obviously, doing a podcast connects you with a bigger and wider audience. Podcasting is such an interesting idea in terms of a voice medium, and the barriers to entry are quite low. So it's definitely worth doing. You don't really need a whole lot of tech to do it, if I'm honest. You just need a microphone and a recorder, and away you go. I can't show you because it's all plugged in here, but down here I have the Zoom H6 handy recorder, which is my recorder of choice. You can record straight into your computer. You can plug your microphone into your computer or even your phone these days, and record straight onto those. I was always taught, actually, with a podcast, you record to a separate recorder just in case it all goes a bit peak-tong with your computer, which it has been known to during a recording. You don't want to lose the entire recording. And so, this is sort of the how I do the podcasting, I suppose. So I record to the H6 handy recorder from Zoom, and the microphone that goes into that is a Rode podcaster mic with an XLR output, which is the input you need for the Zoom recorder. So it's a good quality mic, and that works quite well. There are a few out there that you can get, but I really like Rode's microphones. I've got a lot of their mics. I've got the lapel mics and all that sort of stuff. But actually, the microphone that I'm using is just the Rode podcaster on a mic arm in front of me, and it's as straightforward as that. And I record onto a micro SD card, and then at the end of the show, we take that audio file and I put it into the computer, and we look at it with Adobe's Audition. And the reason we use Audition is because I am a subscriber to Adobe Creative Cloud, and it's part of that, right? You get Photoshop, Illustrator, and all that sort of stuff, but you also get Adobe Audition, and it's just one of those pieces of software that, thanks to YouTube mainly, we figured out how to use along the way, and it's a great piece of kit. Maybe a little bit overkill for the majority of us, but actually I really like it and have grown to use it. And so we do all the editing in Adobe Audition. The podcast is then uploaded to Podbean. This particular podcast is uploaded to Podbean. I also have a podcast which is on Libsyn, and we've tried various other platforms. I like Libsyn. I like podcasts. They're both pretty cool. So do try them out. There are some free ones actually out there, which we're going to try soon. So I will let you know how I get on with those with a different podcast. This is my third podcast, I think. So I do like podcasting. I am used to it as a sort of a medium, and it is great, right? So we use Adobe Audition. I record through the Rode podcaster mic into the Zoom Handy H6. And we upload to Podbean. Podbean then tell Apple and all those people that the podcast is live, which is fab. We also do a blog post usually around each podcast on the Matt Edmundson site. The Matt Edmundson site is built on KD Core, which is the same platform we use for the e-commerce sites, the KD, the Kurious Digital platform, but without all of the e-commerce frills and spills, although that has now been added to the Matt Edmundson site because we're going to be selling courses very soon, and there's a few products that I like that I'm going to put on that website, which I'll tell you more about in upcoming podcasts. Anyway, that is sort of the how we do it. I genuinely record in a separate recording room in our offices, which has got some soundproofing in, not mega loads. You maybe still hear bits and bobs floating around because I'm in a busy warehouse, but it's got it's got enough in to sort of stop the distractions, hopefully. And that's it. And doing a podcast, like I say, is really easy. I've literally done podcasts from my phone, just recording straight into my phone. Podbean have an app where you can record straight into your phone. You don't even need all of the other stuff that I've talked about. The key, obviously, is good audio. So I would say invest in a good microphone if you are going to do a podcast. But why would you want to do a podcast, especially if you have an e-commerce business? Well, I think podcasting is one of those mediums which has remained popular for quite some time, and it is still growing in popularity. You've obviously got other sort of media delivery platforms like YouTube, which are brilliant and valid, but podcasting is different given the fact it is voice only, which makes the barriers to entry, I think, much lower, especially if you feel like, to do videos, I've got to go and hire someone to do it because I don't want to do it, don't want to be in front of a video camera, or I've got to go get the latest camera or some fancy lights. And, the barriers to entry are much, much smaller. And it is popular if you can get it out there. People do subscribe, and generally, keep getting those two words mixed up for some reason. Generally, people do like to listen to podcasts when they're working out or when they're driving in a car. And so we find, it's easy access. People can listen to us while they're doing other things, which is great. So, yeah, all kinds of reasons why I think podcasting is really straightforward. And the fact you do connect to another audience, I think, is actually really, really helpful. And it connects you to a bigger audience, and people feel like they can connect with you. So obviously, when you do a podcast, do it around the topic of your website. There's no point in me doing, a life enhancement podcast if I'm selling pillowcases. I mean, just doesn't make sense, right? But I could do a podcast on how to improve your sleep, and talk to people about how to get better sleep and do a podcast around that topic if I'm selling bedding, for example. So it's fairly straightforward to get the topic. With our beauty website, we did a podcast for the longest time around beauty and what that means. And obviously, you don't necessarily have to talk about products. You can talk about them a little bit, but it's more about the industry, how we're defining beauty, and the consequences of our thinking these days. There's so much good stuff out there. It's almost like you could just keep going, right? So I find podcasting pretty easy to do, to sit and talk. I have an outline, some key points I'm going to hit and sit and talk, and away we go. And from that, we then create, like I say, blog posts, we create social media content. And I find for me, content creation is easy when I start with podcasting. If I sit down in front of a blank computer screen and think, what am I going to write a blog post on? I don't know. I just find that a little bit harder. I suppose I could outline it the same way as a podcast, but it doesn't. I'd rather talk than write, if that makes sense. But you can obviously get podcasts turned into blog posts, get them transcribed. You can edit them out. You can then clip quotes and sayings and put those on your social media, which we've been doing a little bit on Instagram recently, which has been great. So I think that's why you'd want to do it, to aid your marketing efforts, to reach out a client, to give you the content that you need, to give you a voice. And it's a popular medium. And I think it's probably the least competitive one out there. Competitive. It's the least busy. It's maybe the easiest medium to be heard on as things currently stand. Now, some people may correct me on that, but that's just how I feel about it, right? And so podcasting is great. Go out there, try it and experiment. Now, let me run through with you some of the lessons that I have learned from doing this podcast, the Curiosity podcast. The first one is, I mentioned it earlier, as much as, like I say, I like the sound of my own voice, it is good to mix it up and have different voices in there. And we broke it up in the middle of the show with the e-commerce news segments, which you may remember from the previous shows, where Sadaf and I would just generally talk about some of the latest news and findings around all things e-commerce. And that was just a bit of fun, as well as a bit of education, but it was lighthearted and it just broke up the show a little bit. The second thing that I would say is when you do a podcast, give your best content, right? People want to feel like you're giving them value. So don't hold anything back. Just tell people as it is, what's going on. People don't want to feel like scammed. It's like they don't want to feel like, oh, you're only giving me partial stuff and then you're going to charge me money to get the rest of it. They just want to know what's going on. And my experience is the more open we are with people, the more likely they are to want to engage with what we're doing, like in a course or something like that, or in our products or in our services, because people just feel connected, right? It's one of those really interesting sales tips that I give to people. Just tell people everything right at the beginning, and people will decide whether or not to buy it from you. And it's quite a fascinating thing to do. When I do consulting, when I've sat down with consulting clients, we sat usually in my office. I've got a big whiteboard in the office. We spend the whole afternoon talking about their business, their e-commerce business, and we sketch things out on the board. And then at the end of the afternoon, I go, well, there you go. There's a strategy. This is what I would do if I was you. And if you got me in, this is what I would do. But you can now go ahead and do it yourself if you want to. You don't necessarily need me to come in and do it. And most of the times, well, I'd say 95% of the times I've done that, people have gone, that's really great. You've told us exactly what you're going to do. That's super honest, super transparent. Please come and do it, right? So it's the same with podcasts. The better the content you give to people, the more people connect with you, the more they will engage with the products and services that you're doing. So don't hold back. Give your best content. So that'd be my second thing. My third thing would be have fun with it. Podcasting can be a little bit serious, right? Especially if you're in a studio talking to a wall, which often you are when you're recording a podcast, and you've got to picture your audience in front of you. You've got to feel like almost you're on stage and there's your crowd's in front of you, and you've got to go for it. You've got to bring the energy. You've got to have the fun. You've got to bring the content, and you've got to engage them. You can't just act like you're talking to a wall. Otherwise, your voice will get very, very monotone. And that's not great. So that would be my next tip. And coming back to my voice, my next top tip would be when you do a podcast, try and vary the speed in which you talk, vary the amount of pauses you have in the conversation. Don't be afraid to laugh. Don't be afraid to tell jokes. Make it feel like you're having a conversation with the person listening, right? They don't want to feel lectured. They just want to feel like they're having a conversation with you, that you are a friendly and warm guy, unless you are doing a podcast on lecturing, in which case, maybe, just maybe, people won't want to be lectured. I'm not saying either way. Okay, so there's some of the things, top tips that I would give you. The bottom line is you've just got to have a go, record some podcasts, and totally understand the first half a dozen you do are probably going to be rubbish. And that's okay, because that is where the learning is. Just record them, listen to them yourselves. Once you've got through 3 or 4 and you've made some changes, get a bunch of other people to listen to them, get them to tell you what they think, and then hopefully you should have the makings of a pretty good show. And if you are going to do a podcast, let me know, and let me know your podcast link, because I'd love to gander and have a listen and see how it's going, right? I'm definitely not a podcast expert, but I would definitely love to hear about what you're doing. Okay, so that's great. That's some of the lessons learned. What are some of the changes that we're going to make for season 2, and why are we going to make those changes? That's maybe a little bit more interesting. What is actually coming up? So the first and foremost is the podcast. We are now going to try and get a guest in on most episodes. Whereas in season 1, we had a few guests and it was mainly me talking. I think we're going to flip that, and we're going to try and get more guests on the show. So more experts, more helpful interviews and conversations, because I personally find them, well, really fascinating and much, much easier to do from my point of view. In terms of talking to people and interviewing people, I find that much, much easier than just sitting here and talking by myself to the wall, pretending the audience is in front of me, right? So we're going to get more guests on the show. And We're approaching a whole bunch of people right now about getting them on the show. Just some great people in e-commerce that I've met over the years, or that I've heard about, or that I've seen on social media. We're just reaching out to a bunch of people, and we're getting guests on the show to start recording, which is why this podcast will start in season 2, probably early next year, just to give us that buffer to record a few interviews. Now, the other thing that I'm going to do, the main second thing that I'm going to do, hopefully, depending on the guest and how it works, is whenever we record the podcast, I'm going to broadcast the recording on Facebook Live at the same time, right? So what this means is, as we're recording the podcast, and this will be dependent on the guest and what their free time is and what my free time is, but as we get the guests on the show, we're going to stream live onto Facebook, and I'm going to put it onto my Facebook page. So if you've not yet connected with me on Facebook, make sure you head on over to facebook.com/Matt Edmundson Co. CO Matt Edmundson Co. And you should find me, or just search Matt Edmundson, you'll find me on there. And connect with me on Facebook, right? Because when we do the podcast, we're going to send out an invite, one of those Facebook events saying, listen, this recording is going to happen with this guest at this time, and this is what we're talking about. Make sure you join us on Facebook Live. Come along, join in Facebook Live. And on Facebook Live, you'll obviously see, you just heard the ding in the background. Let me give you another top tip when you're recording a podcast. Turn the sounds off your computer, because it sounds much more professional. Anyway, all that aside, back to the Facebook Live. So yeah, come along to the live broadcast. You can obviously listen to the show being recorded. You'll be able to see it, because hopefully my guests will have we'll do it on Skype or however we'll do it, so you'll get to see them. But because of the commenting feature, you will be also able to give comments and ask questions to the guests as the podcast is being recorded. So there's a lot more interaction, which I think will also be a little bit more interesting. So that's the key reason why we're going to broadcast at Facebook Live, is to enable the audience to engage a lot more with that. But also what streaming on Facebook Live does, it means I can also record that. I can put that up to YouTube. And so it means the podcast then becomes content across multiple streams of social media, which just gives me more exposure and connects me with more people, right? So thought about this a lot more. I can then take the video, use them in Facebook ads, Instagram stories, and so on and so forth. So recording it at the same time and streaming it, it's going to be a bit of an experiment. I don't actually know how it's going to turn out. I have to be honest with you. It could be an utter train wreck. So make sure you come along and find out. My hope is actually that it goes quite well and we get some engagement from people and some questions flowing, certainly as people get used to the fact that we are broadcasting it on Facebook Live as well. So they're the two main changes coming in season 2. 1, my plan is to have more guests. And 2, when we record the podcast, we will broadcast live on Facebook at the same time. You can join in that conversation and get involved with it. So that's what we're planning to do. Just to let you know. So there you go. This, like I say, is the end of season 1. I really do appreciate you guys joining in and listening. I thank you for your comments. If you haven't done so yet, please give us a review on iTunes. It really helps us connect with new folks, or whatever platform you listen to your podcast on. It would be great to get the feedback and the reviews. Any questions, ideas you've got for season 2, let me know. In fact, if you want to be a guest on the show, on the podcast, head on over to the website and you can apply to be a guest on the show next year if we've not already reached out to you. It'll be great to have a conversation, have a chat. We can see how it goes. So this, like I say, is me signing off for season 1. There is not going to be any e-commerce news with Sadaf this week. I just want us to do a finisher, just a closer on season 1, just to let you guys know what has been happening and what's going on and why. But just also to say thanks for subscribing. It's been great having you along. And I'll see you on Facebook Live, or you may hear me on the podcast in a month or two's time when we release season 2. So make sure you stay subscribed, stay connected, and stay in touch. If I don't speak to you before, have a very, very Merry Christmas and a brilliant New Year. I hope your e-commerce business is growing and thriving. It's been a heck of a few months, and we're all excited about 2020, right? So I will see you in 2020.
You've been listening to the Curiosity Podcast with Matt Edmundson. Subscribe and join us next time as we carry on conversations about all things e-commerce and digital business.